Good afternoon, everybody, on the eve of the summer solstice, whatever it is. Thank you for coming out on what is actually a lovely day to discuss, I think, one of the more perplexing and challenging and depressing subjects we can think of, namely America's role in the changing Middle East. This ain't 1991. As you all are aware, there have been dramatic changes in this century, starting with September the 11th, 2003, the invasion of Iraq, 2011, the beginnings of the Arab, quote-unquote, spring, which gave us all such high expectations. And then an election here where it was pretty clear that if there's one thing President Obama and President Trump shared, it was a desire not to become more embroiled in Middle East conflicts. And in fact, what we've seen in the last 6 months is our presence is not only growing, but it's becoming more tense and questionable by the day, particularly the encounters over Syria. And just to add to the irony that at the very moment that the country has become very war-weary of events in the Middle East, things seem to be escalating. We thought this would be an appropriate moment to take a look at America's role in a changing Middle East, and changing it certainly is, with all these endless conflicts involving states and non-state actors. And the irony, of course, and this is sort of a hobby horse of mine, is that as long as the conflicts continue, and they are numerous, there's going to be no real effort to address what are some truly fundamental, overarching issues to do with economic development, demography, the environment, chronic water shortage, you name it. In many of these countries, issues that are getting worse by the day and cannot really be addressed until there's an end to the fighting, at least in some areas. If you just take the situation in Yemen, which is running out of water, they're never going to solve their water problem as long as there's war, and that will add to refugees and migration and all the challenges that we've seen from migration in the last 18 months that show no sign of ending. Now, to try to put these issues into a broader perspective than just what's happening in Egypt, what's happening in Turkey, what's happening in Israel, we've asked two scholars who have a very excellent overview of the region and its complexities. And the first speaker, who I'm certain you all know since you see him on TV all the time, is Stephen Cook, who has a new book that has just come out called False Dawn, and I'll read the subtitle, Protest, Democracy and Violence in the New Middle East. And Stephen can talk about the book or whatever he likes. He's going to go first and talk for about 10 to 12 minutes to set the picture. He's with the Council on Foreign Relations and has been now for a number of years. A sterling background, including, I think, a few months as an intern at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he worked for me. So well done, Stephen.
Still on my resume.
And Paul Pilar, who's an old friend, a regular contributor to the National Interest, our journal here, many, many years of service in the U.S. government, particularly in the intelligence agencies, with a special focus on the Middle East. And Paul remains extremely active in his retired life, and thank you both for coming. So 10 to 15 minutes try to keep it under 15 minutes, and then we've got some good people here who will ask lots of tough questions. Stephen, go
Great.
ahead.
Thank you very much, Jeff. It's a great pleasure to be here. Many thanks to you for facilitating the conversation. Many thanks to Paul Saunders for putting this together. And thanks all of you for taking your time this afternoon to come and discuss what is an extremely important issue. I will probably talk for about 10 minutes. The best part of these things for me is always the Q&A, where I get to road test my argument and then people immediately come back and respond to it. So I'm looking forward to that. Much of my remarks will be based on the 5th chapter of my new book, False Dawn, which I snarkily called Getting the Middle East Right. I'm not here to hawk the book, but if you'd like it, I think it's actually a pretty good read. And if you don't read it, still go to Amazon and put stars next to it, because apparently that's the new thing. It used to be my number of Twitter followers were my self-worth. Now it's how many people have rated my book and how many stars it's gotten. Anyway, I had two kind of underlying radical intellectual projects in writing False Dawn. The first, which I really won't discuss today, is to explain why the uprisings in the Arab world and Turkey's transition to democracy failed. The second one is to understand how we, and when I mean we, I mean the United States, how we understand our role in the Middle East. Because quite frankly, we've been getting it wrong for a very long time. And I think that this idea, the uprisings in 2011, gave people the idea that now we had an opportunity to, as I said as I titled chapter 5 of the book, to get the Middle East right. That's not to suggest, I see Tony Kortesman kind of sat up and got his back up. That's not to suggest that we don't know anything. We actually know a lot about the Middle East, but it seems that many of our underlying assumptions about the Middle East are wrong. And in order to have a good foreign policy, you need to have good assumptions about the world. And let's just take the assumptions, the prevailing assumptions that came with the uprisings. It was very simple, that there were uprisings in the Arab world, and this was the Middle Eastern analog of the revolutions in Eastern Europe in 1989 and 1990 and 1991. And that, Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali was Erich Honecker, Hosni Mubarak was General Jaruzelski, and of course Muammar Gaddafi was Nicolae Ceausescu. And things would proceed in a way that, with some time and some help, the Arab world was finally taking part in a great global wave of democratization. Now, of course, I'm simplifying things for effect. Anybody who wrote an op-ed or a foreign policy piece at the time also said, oh, well, the hard work is just beginning, and so on, all this kind of caveating. But really, if you read this enormous amount of work, there was a basic underlying assumption that uprisings meant that there would be transitions to democracy. This isn't any kind of isolated incident. If you're genuinely interested, in the first chapter of the book, I trace what everybody was saying about the Middle East for the last 35 years. Journalists, columnists, think tank land, former government officials, woolly-headed academics, what they had been saying. And there were kind of three waves of discussions. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, everybody was enthralled with the idea that there were shoots of democracy that were blooming in the Middle East. In fact, Egypt and Algeria were called trailblazing cases of democratization. In fact, I'm not going to name the person who said it, but there is a rather well-known scholar of Algeria declared that the Algerian constitution was the most liberal in the Arab world, and this had something to say about the future trajectory of Algerian politics. It may have been quite liberal, but he made this pronouncement on the eve of the military's coup that canceled the 1991 elections that led to a decade of civil war and perhaps 200,000 dead. And so when Egypt and Algeria and Jordan didn't actually become democracies, we then went on this decade-long discussion of the durability of authoritarianism until, of course, September 11th, and then we had the freedom agenda and promoting democratic change in the region. And we were just on the cusp of saying that doesn't work when the uprisings happened, and there was a reassessment of all of the work and all of the discussion about how we should think about politics in the Middle East that was informing our underlying assumptions of the region. And the major reassessment was done was done by Ellen Lapson and a number of colleagues at the Stimson Center, trying to figure out how it had all gone wrong, how everybody, U.S. government, but basically, what we were doing over the course of those 35 years was surfing news cycles. As things seemed to change, new kind of assumptions emerged in both the, broadly speaking, analytic community as well as in among the people who are actually making policies. So, just to kind of bring it up to date and to where we are now, in the immediate aftermath of the uprisings, after Mubarak fell, after Ben Ali fell, after Gaddafi was chased from Libya and Syria's uprising began, there was a tremendous effort among analysts, both here in Washington and around the country, to generate ideas about how to help transitions to democracy in the region. And the rate of production was absolutely outstanding. But most of these ideas were hollow. And I'll give you a number of examples of these. The first was, this is a direct quote from a kind of major work on post-Arab Spring U.S. policy in the region. The United States should play the role of global coordinator that would bring the resources of Europe, Asia, the wealthy Arab states of the Persian Gulf, and rising powers such as Turkey and Brazil to invest politically and financially in transitions in the Middle East. That doesn't sound like anything terribly new or terribly insightful or that would even work, given what was actually happening on the ground. Second example, another group of important scholars and policy people. Both the United States and European countries have a role to play in trying to steer competing Arab elites away from acrimonious and ultimately sterile ideological debates and toward more practical problem solving. I mean, you can't get much more banal than that, right? This is what kind of passed for what we're thinking, because there was this assumption that democracy would follow. And then, of course, finally, the thing that's been rattling around the Beltway for as long as I can remember, at least since I was an intern for Jeff, was that the Middle East needs a new Marshall Plan. Again, that if we just build it, democracy would follow. And look, I don't mean to criticize my colleagues. Someone actually asked me once, recently, who's going to be angered by my book? And I said everybody. But if you want a friend in Washington, apparently you get a dog. So it's not that big deal. But I'm not suggesting that the people who wrote these things and said these things were not bright. In fact, many of them are extremely, extremely smart with years and years of government service. The issue, and this is the heart of it, the issue was the nature of the problem. The idea that we were finally going to get the Middle East right and help shape democratic politics in the region was, I think, an underlying assumption of the way in which we approached the entire Middle East, starting in 9/11, but particularly after the uprisings in 2011, was something that was odd. What was happening in the region actually had very little to do with the United States, unless, of course, you accept the premise that Operation Iraqi Freedom was somehow connected to the uprisings. And there were plenty of people who did that at the time, and believe me, they get special attention here in the book. But it wasn't at all clear, first, that people wanted the United States' help in transitions to democracy. They certainly didn't want that help in Egypt, a country that's a quarter of the Arab world, and that kind of still, despite Egypt's tribulations over the course of the last decade or more, still kind of sets the tone for the region. When Egypt feels revolutionary, the region feels revolutionary. When Egypt feels authoritarian, the region kind of feels authoritarian. There was a limited role for the United States because the United States didn't understand, policymakers didn't understand, that the way in which people were identifying their domestic struggles and conflicts, they were identifying it in existential types of terms. If you remember the coup in Egypt in 2013, all of those kind of, the liberals who were celebrated in 2011 came out full-throated support for Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and the coup. And they said, we have no choice because we are fighting for the heart and soul of our country. So when people define their conflicts in those types of terms, no matter what the Secretary of State says, no matter what the President of the United States does, no matter how many weapons he provides or takes away from leaders, they are going to calculate their interests based on local conditions and how they are going to survive this kind of existential struggle. Our assumption that we could somehow help facilitate transitions to democracy in this environment was way, way, way off. And we paid the price for it in a number of places. We paid the price for it in Egypt, we paid the price for it in Libya, and we paid a price for it in other places. I haven't spoken about Syria. We can talk about that in more detail. So the question is, what should we do? What should we do in the Middle East? What are the basic assumptions that should guide us? Well, the first one is that to understand that most transitions to democracy fail. So that when we have another Arab Spring, we should understand that across the board, the chances are no matter what country is having this Arab Spring, it may not actually be a spring. And it's important. The way in which we talked about it, the way in which we framed the issue as a spring gave us this kind of false impression that things were going to change. But what should we do? We need to get back to basics in the region. And what are the things that we have been worried about, concerned about, that have been our core interests for the past 6 decades or so, remain the things that are important to us now. And that is the free flow of energy resources out of the region, helping to ensure Israeli security, making sure no other country in the region dominates the region other than the United States, and then derivative of those three is counterterrorism and counterproliferation. Those are the things that are extremely important to us, and those should be the things around which we base our policy in the region. We talk. I know the tagline on the website for the Center for National Interest is it's about strategic realism. This word strategic is something that gets thrown around Washington. You go down on the street on Connecticut Avenue. I think this is a town where everybody thinks they're the smartest person. Ask them what strategic or strategy means. They have no idea what it is. And what I'm calling for is kind of this strategic realism, matching up what our national resources are with what is important to us, what our national goals are. And under those circumstances, I don't really have a tremendous problem with what President Trump said in Riyadh when he said, look, we're not going to make you democracies. We have other priorities. We're not going to lecture to you. We're putting to bed the freedom agenda. A lot of people took that as a criticism of President Obama. It was really a criticism of President George W. Bush. Though, to be honest with you, I don't like the cut in the international affairs budget. And I think we can be at least rhetorical about our values. In the end, it's important to understand that what's happening in places like Egypt, Libya, Turkey, and Tunisia, and I'm purposefully leaving out Syria and Yemen and Iraq here for specific reasons, but what's happening in those places, Egypt, Libya, Turkey, Tunisia, are Egyptian, Libyan, Turkish, and Tunisian stories. They're not the kind of thing where the United States, the kind of situation where the United States has the leverage, the insight, or the influence to alter the trajectory of politics in those places. And it's important also to understand that these countries, perhaps with the exception of Libya, which is fragmenting and fragmenting again, but that these countries, by and large, are going to be authoritarian and unstable going forward. I think how that affects our interests, the interests that I just delineated, oil, Israel, U.S. hegemony, and the two derivative interests, how that affects those interests is what's really important to the United States. Not promoting good governance in a place like Egypt, which doesn't have good governance and isn't likely to have good governance. I think our role should be not smaller, not bigger, but right-sized to what's actually important to the United States. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. That's a lot to think about. And Paul, what would you add to that?
Well, thanks, Jeff. The unifying theme of what I'm going to add, and it's very consistent with one of Stephen's closing comments, is that the ability of outsiders, including but not limited to the United States, to shape this region in their image or for the good is quite limited. And that ability tends to get overstated more than it tends to get understated or accurately perceived. One of the central underlying realities of this region is that it exhibits multipolarity with a vengeance. That's true whether you're looking just at the insiders, the states in the region, actors in the region, or the insiders and the outsiders that are mucking into the region. And that multipolarity is overlaid on an asymmetrical spider's web of intersecting lines of conflict that make it very inappropriate to try to go back to a Cold War type image where we were thinking of the region more in terms of are we ahead or are the Soviets ahead. And today it is a misfit with this region for any would-be builder of some kind of grand coalition efforts at which immediately run into these other intersecting lines of conflict and that run afoul of other interests that the would-be coalition builder has. And we've seen this, of course, quite recently with regard to the Gulf states and what the United States administration today is trying to do. For much of the region, the ethnic and sectarian geography means that acute sectarian ethnic divisions underlie the instability of individual states. And for much of the time prior to the Arab Spring, I'll use that term despite all the reasons that Stephen gave that it's not a really good term, in several places, authoritarian regimes kept a lid on open manifestations of these conflicts that later came out in a very big and violent way. Places like Syria, where the Assads had ruled since Hafez took power in a coup in 1970. Places like Iraq, where after a series of coups, where the authoritarian regime settled down more or less under the dictatorial rule of Saddam Hussein and the Baathists. Or even Egypt, which did not have the same kind of ethnic conflicts, but it does have a religious dimension with the Coptic Christians and the Muslims. You had Mubarak in power for many years. So when some of that authoritarian lid got pried off, what was underneath started bubbling out. And the bubbling doesn't stop even when there are further political changes, because what was taking place earlier, pre-Arab Spring, was not any resolution of these conflicts. It was simply pressing down on the lid. And despite some hopefully expressed views that distractions of one sort or another with regard to some challenges and divisions will cause other divisions and conflicts to fade away from consciousness. I mean, you hear it quite often, for example, that the Palestinian issue is, well, it's just not that important anymore because everyone's worried about Iran. Would that it be so. That is one of a number of ethnically or sectarian-based sets of consciousness and sets of grievances that don't just go away, no matter how much anyone, governments, regimes, or publics are distracted by other conflicts in this asymmetric spider's web. Anything that looks like widespread liberal democracy in the region is still very far away. And Steve's addressed it specifically in his book. I mean, my kind of oversimplistic explanation for this is it's basically a matter of insufficient political culture of the sort that supports liberal democracy. And when I say culture, I'm not talking about people of certain religions or ethnicities being inherently incapable of enjoying the fruits of liberal democracy. George W. Bush was quite right in saying to believe that is to express ethnic prejudice. Rather, it's a matter of the time required in terms of not just years but centuries in some cases to develop the sort of political culture that supports what we know as in the West as liberal democracy. Stephen mentioned the comparison often made between Arab Spring and the Eastern European upheavals of the late 80s and early 90s. I think the more apt comparison is with the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, which, although it did result in a change of regime in France, overall the results were pretty meager and disappointing compared to the extent of the upheaval, which was really continent-wide in Europe. And if you say, well, some of the political culture in Europe in the first half of the 19th century might be closer to what we have in the Middle East today, I think that gets to my point about how long it takes to develop that culture. As for the outside players, you have not only a variety of motives involved, but a variety of types of motives. I mean, Russia, for example, all right, heavily involved in Syria because that's its one real toehold in the region, and doing what Russia has done in Syria is another way of making the point that it is still a force to be reckoned with in the region. A kind of special set of interests that are very important to Russia. Turkey, the incentives seem to have changed over time from some kind of echoes of the Ottoman Empire ideas of how Turkey can be a benign influence in all the Arab countries to the south, to what seemed to be somewhat more parochial and immediate concerns with Kurdish nationalism and with the relations with neighboring states, Syria, Iran, and the not quite neighboring state, Russia. The European Union, their most pressing concern in most recent years has been the refugee problem. If you're talking about why they would be worried about upheaval in the Middle East and what they want to do about it. The Chinese, as always, are concerned with commercial things, and even when they get involved in something that has a security tinge, like some recent exercises they had with the Iranians, the commercial opportunities are always behind that. Or you could look at someone like India, another different type of motivation. When the Indians are calibrating their relationship, say, with the Iranians, what's first in their mind is not some of the things that go through our heads when we think about the Iranians, but rather India's rivalry with Pakistan, the country in between India and Iran, and how India might try to pull with Iran the sort of thing that China has tried to do with its relations with Pakistan, that sort of thing. All the outsiders have serious limitations in trying to extend their writ in this region. And this is a matter not just of competition with the other outsiders, but of various issues they have with the insiders. For example, we hear a lot, it was just mentioned in the lead editorial in the Washington Post this morning, about we ought to be concerned about Russia's forming an alliance with Iran. Well, there's no doubt that Russian policy will try to take advantage in any way it can of U.S. refusal of the current administration to do any business with Iran. But it's not like Russia and Iran have a basis for a loving relationship. And you remember things like what happened during and after World War II when the Soviets occupied the northern half of the country. Then at the end of the war, the Western powers, especially the British, did what they said they would do. They pulled out. And Stalin, he was slow in pulling out. You had a Russian presence that lingered on. And not only did it linger on, but the Soviets set up puppet separatist entities with the Azeris and the Kurds. I mean, these things are not forgotten. And that was just a few years earlier than the events of 1953, the overthrow of Mossadegh, in which, as we all know, have definitely not been forgotten with regard to Iranian views of the United States and Britain. The multipolarity and intensity of the inside the region conflicts is one of the biggest limitations on expansion of influence by any outsider. You got several of these players, the Russians, the Chinese, the Europeans, the Indians, who would love to have more developed relations with the GCC states. But they don't want to do that at the expense of relationships with Iraq and Iran, with various kinds of commercial and economic interests being involved on both sides of the Gulf. Of all the outsiders, the United States, and I'm focusing specifically under its current management, I would argue does the worst job of playing the multipolar game in this region because of our tendency to despite what I said before, try to divide everything in our traditional Manichaean way between good guys and bad guys, and refuse to do business with the bad guys. The Russians, I think, are the best at playing this game, and we've got a lot of lessons to learn from them. So when you look at things like Russian dealings with Iran, we're not talking about an alliance, per the Washington Post editorial. We are talking about a prudent, realistic, and realist way of dealing with the various conflicts and lines of division in this region, realizing that there might not be a true alliance on any one side of a loving sort, but that there are advantages to be gained all around. The best news from the U.S. point of view is that some results of everything I've described here is that nobody, either insider or outsider, is in a position to dominate the whole region, which was one of the objectives, as Stephen appropriately mentioned. And I would say it's the prime objective that we ought to keep in mind in shaping U.S. policy toward the region. And so that's the good news. Even though we're not playing the multipolar game as skillfully as some others like the Russians are, at least that doesn't mean that somebody else is going to take over the region in a way that can dictate, oil export policy and all that sort of thing. The huge, let us not forget it, demonstration about limitation of U.S. ability to shape the region continues to be, in my view, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Not only because it demonstrated the limitations of making something over in our own image or exporting liberal democracy through the barrel of a gun, but also because what happened there after that invasion underlies today much of what we're dealing with in terms of the ethnic and sectarian consciousness and lines of conflict. The Iraqi civil war that ensued was probably more than anything else, stirred that consciousness with Sunnis and Shia thinking of themselves as Sunni and Shia, and not just as Muslims, at least as much as any other event I can think of, over the last quarter century or so. And it also got into the non-state actors, which Jeff referred to earlier, lest we forget what we now know as ISIS began under a different name as a direct consequence of the disorder that followed the invasion of Iraq. So my kind of summary comment is to underline what I said before. Let's emulate the Russians in terms of dealing with this fractured, multipolar, multi-conflict region, in realizing that there isn't any one partner here that shares many of our values. There are many partners that share some of our interests, but also conflict with our interests in other ways. And so there's an opportunity to do a lot of diplomatic and political and economic business, but we, like others, are not going to make the region over in our own image.
Well, thank you so much, and thoughtful words, and pretty depressing, I have to say. So on that, I will take names of those who want to speak. I've already got two. I've got three now. When the microphone comes to you, please state who you are so that others can know. While you're thinking about what questions you have, let me just begin by a sort of a general theme that's often bothered me. I mean, the extent to which Americans, and not just Americans, but sort of go for Europeans as well, have been influenced in their thinking about what is going on in the region and what needs to be resolved by talking to Western educated, highly articulate people from the region who have very similar values to ourselves, but who do not represent the majority of the elite that they come from, and that all of us have been engaged over the last 25 years in meetings with Iranians and Iraqis and Egyptians and Arabs and Israelis, and we all tend to talk to people who've been educated the University of Kentucky and Oxford, and they are very westernized, and yet, and they say things that we like to hear, and I think certainly in the case of the Iraq War, a lot of our decision-making was based on advice from local people from the Middle East who spoke the language we wanted to hear them speak, and it wasn't the reality on the ground. So, I think we've been misserved in some respects by the well-educated Middle Easterners we've sent back to the region.
I think that that's true and across the board, and I just respond to it in two separate ways. One, with an anecdote, because this is Washington and you can traffic in anecdotes, but I remember I have a friend who was a traditional academic who spent some time at the State Department, and he's an expert on Islam, and he was being sent to Egypt, and he called me and he said, who can I talk to in Egypt, but I'm afraid that the embassy isn't going to let me meet anybody. And I gave him a list of people that I knew, and then we met up a few days before he left, and I said, did you reach out to these people? He said, the embassy won't let me. And my parting words to him were, have fun with Barbara Ibrahim, Ali Salem, and Abdulmanam Said Ali. The three people that the embassy always set you up with to talk to. And I think that this is a function of a problem both with who's safe for the embassy to talk to, the fact that people in the embassy don't get out as much as they did. In the past, they don't speak to people who are not representative of this very elite class. And then the other thing, there's a kind of willful desire when it comes to the analysis in this region of looking at Islamist groups in a way that I don't think actually fully captures what it is they stand for and what it is they want. For 20 years, we have been hearing that the Muslim Brotherhood can be a steward of reform and democratization because the Muslim Brotherhood wrote one thing after another, saying these things designed specifically to embed that idea in the minds of people like myself and others, as well as their own audience, when in fact we know, now by experience, that the Brotherhood really had no intention of being proper stewards of democracy, reform, and change in a place like Egypt. They were kind of, they were authoritarians, and had a transformative project for Egypt that was highly authoritarian and centered on their idea of kind of moral religious values. And we had no real conception of it. People were actually surprised by this.
Yeah, I agree completely, Jeff, and you're right about the Iraq War. Paul Wolfowitz, besides listening to Ahmed Chalabi, went off to Dearborn, Michigan, listening to some exiles there, and became convinced that there were millions of Iraqis who had Midwestern Democrats inside just waiting to come out. I think
Small D Democrats, right?
Yeah, that's right. Somewhat similar misconceptions with regard to Syria, too, where we had some of these very articulate, highly educated people, we've dealt with, including here in the Washington area, who represent a tiny proportion of, what was the larger picture over there. Stephen mentioned, some of the challenges and perhaps, room for improvement with regard to embassy reporting. Clearly, our intelligence services have the responsibility to get beyond all this and get to places and talk to people where we get a more complete picture. That's always been a challenge. It's been a problem. As we know, the Iranian Revolution and insufficient anticipation of it, or insufficient appreciation for the conditions that made it possible, is a more precise way I should put it, is at or near the top of most lists of U.S. intelligence failures.
And the ambassador at the time was the former head of the CIA, right?
Well, actually moved on to a different ambassador by then, but Helms had his time earlier, yes.
Just one quick thing on your last point, Paul. When it came to the uprisings in the Arab world, I think the intelligence community was actually onto something. It was the rest of us on the outside who said, no, Mubarak's stable, there's stability is going to be the dominant trend in the region. But the people at your former colleagues at the NIC were quite worried about what might happen in the region.
Well, that is true, and I'm on the receiving end, and maybe you are too, of any time something untoward like a coup or revolution happens in the world, I get a call from reporters saying, why was there this intelligence failure?
Right.
And I said, what do you know about the intelligence that the U.S. services gave to the White House? Did you read that stuff? Did you get a leaker? Oh, no, it's just, in other words, anything that surprised us is defined as an intelligence failure. I think you're probably right about that, Steve, although, the Iranian Revolution, we've had enough time and there's been enough declassified that one can be a little more critical on that one.
Okay, so now I've got at least 4 people down on my little list here, beginning with Tony Cordesman.
Parenthetically, I do have to say, having worked for Richard Helms, that the number of people in state and in the intelligence service who were not particularly welcomed in saying so, Jack Miklas, Henry Preck, Doug Heck, and a number of others, who warned very clearly about the show over nearly 10 years, we had every possible warning. Denial at a different level of policy was not the fault of the people who gave the warnings. But I think one thing that strikes me about what you said is we're dealing with a very strange region in terms of American strategic interests. It basically has one value to the United States. It exports about 17 million barrels of oil a day through the Straits, about 23 million barrels of oil equivalent, and it supports the economies and export capabilities of 6 major exporters to the United States, which now is far more important than American dependence on oil imports. What makes it unique is, unlike Africa or Latin America, there isn't a single industrial output from the MENA region or a single critical commodity other than oil and gas. It is unique in that respect, and neither of you have mentioned the need to keep that flowing. Now, whether they kill each other in the process, I would admit, is not strategically important to the United States. If you use the word strategic, I'm not sure where casualties and collateral damage become relevant. And I raise this because I think we need to be much better in defining our terms about strategic interest. You have raised, I think, a critical point in terms of democracy and human rights. But I think here again, let's go back to warning. The Arab Development Reports, as of about 2002, warned again and again, as Jeff did, about the demographic impact, problems with youth unemployment, corruption, the lack of quality of governance, and if anybody can find any correlation between the quality of governance and human rights and titular democracy anywhere, I'd really be impressed, because it's an American ideological belief for which I don't think we can find any clear substance. But I raise that because if they said that in 2002, and I think they were correct, and as you pointed out, we've gone from 2011 to 2017, having fundamentally undermined stability, economic development, and all of the criteria which can actually provide for stability in the Middle East, we end up with 2 questions. What can you do that makes things better? And second, how do you keep up the one thing that really matters in this region in narrow material terms, which is the constant flow of petroleum products?
Would either of you like to take a crack at that?
Yeah, sure. Just very quickly, perhaps I was not as loud as I normally am. But when it came down to my own question, what should we do? And I said, get back to basics. The first thing I mentioned was the free flow of oil out of the region. I couldn't be in more agreement with you that this is what is the first and foremost interest of the United States in the region. And when I mean get back to basics, it means putting oil first rather than having good governance conferences at the Four Seasons Nile Plaza. It strikes me that that's a better use of our resources, is ensuring that that happens. Now, you mentioned the Arab Human Development Reports and the things that we can do better. I think that those reports were interesting and important in providing a kind of baseline understanding of things that we already understood was happening in the region. What can we do to make things better? I'm not sure that the United States, the West, the world, Asia, the wealthy Arab countries, whoever is mentioned, the people who are supposed to contribute to the new Marshall Plan, can make those things better, given the quality of politics in these countries. The leaders in those countries have to be willing, have to have the will, and have to be receptive to the idea of making things better, and which is why, although Tunisia is not the quote-unquote one Arab Spring success story, it has done marginally better than some of the other countries. Now, to your last question, which was similar to your first, how is it that we keep the oil flowing? I think our continued investment in security and our relationships in the region, which, there's a lot to criticize. There's a lot this administration has gotten wrong in the region already. But the investment in those relationships, with the exception of signing on to the Emirati-Saudi effort to isolate the Qataris, there should have been a different approach to this conflict, perhaps one more akin to when this conflict has reared its head in the past. But nevertheless, what I see that the Trump administration is doing, if you kind of peel away all of the kind of, how should I put this diplomatically, all of the kind of interesting things that go along with the current president, is a return to a more traditional American approach to the region, which I think has oil and security first.
Tony, thank you for bringing these things up, because I think you've sort of filled in some of the things that Stephen and I kind of alighted over. Of course, it comes down to hydrocarbons, as ultimately as what makes this region special. And because of that, and I should have made this a line of argument in earlier remarks, avoiding armed conflagration in the Persian Gulf region is one of the most important things to make sure that that trade does not get disrupted. And that is one reason why I think the ill-advised picking of fights and taking of sides of the sort that we've seen recently, I was emphasizing how that does not conform well with the reality of the lines of conflict and competition in the region. But the other thing that should have been said that your question brings out nicely is it carries, of course, the risk of the greater risk of armed conflagration, which will bring about the exact result we try to avoid, which is interrupting the flow of hydrocarbons.
So Oder Aberdeen was next on my list. Hang on, Oder, just a moment.
In addition to oil, there are markets in the region that create over 5 million jobs. Every day, 5 million Americans go to work because of what we export to the region, and we haven't talked about that. The other point I want to highlight, which wasn't mentioned, we have a youth bulge that is awakened. That's what Brzezinski used to talk about in emerging markets, in emerging countries. American technology has contributed to this awakening through the internet, through modern communications. If you go through the Arab press, and I go through it every night, and I don't read just the pro-established press, I try to go, you'll be amazed at the letters that people write about corruption, about the fact that there is no justice. And that leads me to believe that if we want to have stability, it should be by consent, not by imposition. For the last 50 years, we had stability in the Middle East up until the Arab Spring, which was stability by imposition. And that policy cannot continue. Now, if you go back again to the Arab Spring, everybody was surprised. But we were reading the established press here and in the Arab region. We were reading papers that were owned by governments. But yet you can feel something was wrong, something was brewing. So to many people, the Arab Spring was not a surprise, especially after the internet has become a voice, a mechanism for awakening people. And we should keep that in mind.
Thank you.
Thanks. Oh, can I?
Yes, go ahead.
Just, one thing. I think you're absolutely right. If you look at Arab social media, well, all kinds of things, there is youth that have awakened and want, and just because this episode was a false dawn doesn't mean the next one will be. Many of the same conditions exist, but I think the nature of these things, whether you want to call them revolutions, which I don't, or uprisings, they are unpredictable. I mean, when I get those phone calls from that Paul does and say, how come the intelligence community missed it? I say, well, you actually should read a book about revolutions, because by their very nature, these are unpredictable types of things. But what I really wanted to focus on was this issue of stability by consent. I can't imagine anybody disagreeing with that sentiment. But how does the United States or the West in general create that consent for the Arab world or in Turkey? I'm not sure how we do it. We have spent significant sums, not huge, but significant sums on trying to make this kind of thing work over a period of 15 years. And I think our return on investment is pretty meager. Just look at what USAID's own self-study of what they did in Egypt. I think it came out in 2009. Not one goal was met. Now, that's not necessarily a problem just of USAID, but it's, as I said, putting USAID in a political environment where leaders are not receptive to this idea of consent makes it extremely difficult for us to alter the trajectory of politics.
Two quick comments. Oda, you're absolutely right to mention the other markets. And if we had a representative from Boeing here, he could tell us about how many American jobs are generated by exporting aircraft to a place like Iran. And those markets are being exploited by eagerly exploited by other external actors. And to the extent that we insist on making political and psychological gestures, imposing sanctions or embargoes and that sort of thing, we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot. And then the other part of your comment, you mentioned justice. And I think in this part of the world, when we talk about values and where values might or might not be shared with us, justice comes up at least as much and probably more so than democracy. And it's justice in a broader sense than we usually use the term. We think in terms of legal procedure. Justice, in the way I think you raised it and where it's discussed in this region, does get into questions of economic opportunity and so on. So if we're going to, anyone who wanted to take a more values-based approach to trying to manipulate or work with the politics of this region, just saying, well, it's liberal democracy or nothing else is making a mistake. We have to understand justice as the people in the region understand it.
Ted, you were next, actually.
Well, I've always thought it's
This is Ted Katouf.
Ted Katouf, sorry, Amid East, a nonprofit. I always thought it's unfortunate that we haven't had more good sociological studies of the Middle East and North Africa. Maybe that sociology is a neglected discipline even in U.S. academia, but there hasn't been the room, the space, the freedom for good research often to be carried out in the Middle East region. But Paul spoke about the political culture. Tony spoke about the institutional failings brought out in the UNDP report. But it seems to me that underlying all of this is the authoritarian nature of culture in that part of the world. And it doesn't matter Muslim, Christian, Sunni, Shia, what tribe you're from. there is a pervasive, millennial prevailing of authoritarian trends, starting in the family, the patriarchy. And patriarchy is used a lot, but in the Middle East, it's for real. And if the father dies, then the oldest brother is the one you go to and you ask, can I study at a university? Can I study this or that? Can I marry this woman? You have it in religion, of course, but religion by definition is about the one single truth. But nevertheless, it's very, very prominent. You have it in schools, the way teaching is done, the authority the teachers have, the way they demand that students often sit silently and take notes and absorb the wisdom that they're giving them so they can regurgitate it back on a test. And the political culture loves it because all these structures play into the what the political leaders want, which is obedient citizens. And so I think there is a certain congruence between the political culture, family culture, social culture in the region. Culture does change. Internet, media, et cetera, is having an effect, but it doesn't change that quickly, and I think we have to respect that.
Yeah, very good point.
I think it's an excellent observation, Ted, and it helps explain the deepness of the roots of the political culture and how hard it is to change and how long it takes to change. Go back to my point about Enlightenment values and the contrast with Europe. It really was a matter of centuries lag between resisting the sort of authoritarian aspects in the non-political sphere, in the university, in the family, Luther nailing his theses to the door and so on. It was another 3 centuries or so before we really got into things like popular suffrage and something closer to liberal democracy of the modern sort. There's no reason to expect that it's going to be dramatically quicker in the Middle East than it was in Europe.
Ted, sorry, Paul, are you done?
No, done, yeah.
Ted, very quickly, if you've been trained in an American university, if you've gotten a PhD in political science, history, sociology, or even anthropology in the United States in the last 3 or 4 decades, you can't talk about culture. You can't talk about religion. You can't talk about patrimonial systems. Hisham Sharabi wrote a book about patrimonialism in the Arab world and was criticized for doing it. And so I think that we've gotten to the point where we're afraid of it and that we should re-examine culture as a factor in these things. And I certainly agree with you 100%. And it's something that I kind of go up and I kind of touch in this book. And I say, there's something about authoritarian systems that create a cultural milieu that reproduces authoritarian systems and so on, whether it's at the family level or in a political system. I don't know, maybe that'll be the next book, but I think it's time to bring these ideas of culture back into our analysis. I think you're 100% right. No, that's not possible, Ted. You just graduated.
Paul Saunders was next.
I had a comment and also a question, and the question goes a little bit in the same direction as some of the previous questions. My comment is it was interesting for me that both of you mentioned this kind of desire to compare Central Europe and what happened in Central Europe in 1989 with the Middle East. When I was in the Bush administration, there was a concerted effort to bring political leaders from Central Europe actually to Iraq and to introduce them to these different leaders in Iraq, and they share their experiences and how did we transition from authoritarianism and what can our experience contribute to you. So, that was there definitely well before 2011. I'm talking about like 2003, 2004. On this question of these societies and what can we do and what can we not do. You know, culture, it seems to me, is something that is very difficult for anyone outside that particular culture to have a useful input into, at least in a way that doesn't generate a lot of resentment. There's a second component, of course, which is institutions. And you know, I think we have to be kind of honest with ourselves that institutions are shaped by culture, and even if you create perfect institutions, you know, the culture will influence how people use them, use the institutions, how they work in practice. But you know, to what extent can we try to help with institutions? And one of the things we're always trying to do, of course, in particular, is political parties, because we want to have multiple parties. And again, on one level, very complex. On another level, you know, if you want to have a society that operates on any basis other than religious or ethnic differences, then you have to have some kind of structure that amalgamates people along other lines of shared interests, like economic interests, for example. Is there anything useful that the United States can do?
You want to take a first crack at it?
Sure. I was struck by the, you know, when the uprisings happened, there was all kinds of stuff. 1989, 1848, 1968, who knows? And then we had the obsession with the Turkish model, too. We're looking for things to help us, in very, very complex situations, things to help us make sense of it. But interestingly, just as an aside, I have a Syrian friend from Aleppo who's here in the United States, not a supporter of the Assad regime, not a supporter of anybody, just disgusted and sad about everything. But she's absolutely convinced, you know the famous phrase in the famous squares all over the Middle East, that people demand the downfall of the regime. She's convinced that that was a line that was given to people who were trained in Eastern Europe, to Arabs who were trained in Eastern Europe with all those, you know, NDI, IRI, MEPI training programs, so on and so on. So just as an aside. Now, institutions are an extraordinarily important part of this story, an extraordinarily important part of the failure of the uprisings in the region. That's because they reflect the interests of those who are in power. And because you didn't have revolutions and you essentially had personnel changes, the institutions that shaped politics essentially remained in place, even in a place like Libya. The informal institutions of Libyan politics that had shaped politics that took over and were kind of created this fragmentary pressure on the country. So the question is, what can the United States then do? If you look at it this way, we often have, and this is an underlying assumption that I think is wrong, that the Middle East is under-institutionalized. There's a lack of institutions in the Middle East. Actually, it's robustly institutionalized, but it's perverse. Right? So where the institutions of the Egyptian state reflect the interests of Egyptian military officers who have really no interest in laying the groundwork for democracy, despite how many times they're going to say it. So what role does the United States? Well, then if you take it at that, and I'm exaggerating for effect, then we have to have policy of regime change or revolution in the region. And this is precisely why I say this is an Arab story, it's an Egyptian story, it's a Libyan story, it's a Tunisian story. It's up to them. Especially given all of those security interests Tony walked out, or that Tony has thought about his entire career, Jeff has thought about his entire career, Paul, why would we want to do that if our prime directive is the free flow of energy resources out of the region? We tried that once. It was post 9/11 freedom agenda. Our democratic allies in the region will be better allies for the United States. Too bad that the leaders in the region, the regimes that they defended, and the institutions reflected we had very little impact on that.
institutions, certainly very important, and they can be institutions that existed under the ancien regime and are repurposed to serve a new order if you do have revolutionary change. I remember, speaking of Europe, Eastern Europe, circa 1989, I was the executive assistant to the Director of Central Intelligence at the time and accompanied him on what was the first trip by a U.S. intelligence chief to Eastern Europe after the fall of communist regimes. And so we were dealing with the likes of the Poles and Hungarians and so on. And you had these services which throughout the Cold War had been part of the adversary. And now they were, pulling out the red carpet, and we had all these lavish dinners and everything, and schmoozing with these very same people. Now, okay, here, this was Europe with all those other cultural differences we talked about, but I think the general lesson can apply in places. Talking about Iraq, 2003, this gets into the still controversial issue about disbanding the army. I don't want to get people started on that, but I think that that's relevant. That's relevant to your issue. In this sort of repurposing and trying to take advantage of whatever viability and structure and institutional sense you have with whether it's a military or a security service or whatever, then I think what we can and should do is use whatever leverage we have with regard to technical assistance and so on to push for clean versus corrupt organizations and anything else that will improve their well-earned respect, and it has to be well-earned with the population in the new political order. And we do have leverage on things like technical assistance. The only other thing I mentioned in response to your question, Paul, you mentioned political parties, very important as well, and I think there are some things in the way of sort of, this would come under technical assistance too, or training. And the Republican and Democratic organizations that do this stuff overseas, are already helpful in this. How to run a campaign, that sort of thing, as one of the ingredients of something closer to a competitive democracy is something that we have a lot of expertise on and we can provide help on, and that helps an institution like a new political party as well as the other sort of institutional help I mentioned.
Especially drawing boundaries.
Yeah, that's right.
So we
gerrymander.
are getting, we've got for 25 minutes, and let me just quickly go through who I have on the list so that you don't feel left out or make sure I'm not missing anyone. I had John Allen Gay, then Henri Barquet, then Jacob Heilbrum, and then the gentleman next to Ted Katuth, and then, yes, you're after Marvin Weinbaum, then you. So, and you had a double finger. 10 seconds, it is.
The 50 political parties in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq were very representative. They were liberals, conservative, Muslim Brotherhood, the Egyptian parliament, the Syrian parliament. All of that went down the drain when the juntas took over. So you had institutions. They were not as liberal, as democratic as the U.S., but you had tolerant political system.
Okay, John, you're next. You got a...
Yeah, so, I'm inclined to agree with the kind of oil exportation first account of U.S. interests with regards to the Middle East. But I'm curious if this kind of strategy of hegemony or primacy in the region is necessarily the way that we have to go about pursuing that. Because if Paul is correct that the region has these characteristics of multipolarity with a vengeance, the web of intersecting conflicts where building coalitions is very hard, couldn't it be the case that a less forward-leaning U.S. role would be sufficient to prevent the emergence of a regional hegemon that could potentially threaten the flow of oil? That a strategy of kind of passive U.S. hegemony where we're not really actively involved, or a strategy of offshore balancing where we're simply preventing the emergence of these large-scale coalitions which sounds like it should be a pretty easy job, that may be sufficient to defend U.S. interests rather than a more active, forward-leaning, present sort of role.
One of you take it.
Go ahead,
because
Paul. I'm nominating Paul to take that.
Yes, absolutely, I agree with you 100%. You know, not having some other hegemon dominating the region is not to be equated with us trying to dominate the region as a hegemon. And things like the free flow of oil, yes, they do not require domination by anyone, and the lack of a hegemon permits the sort of free commerce that we were talking about when with the dialogue with Tony. And as I mentioned in responding to his question, the larger hazard is armed conflict that can disrupt things, you know, hegemon or no hegemon. So I agree with you completely, John.
Okay, Henri, you are next. That's Henri Barquet from the
Henri
Wilson
Barquet from Wilson Center. First of all, on oil, the problem is not just the free flow of oil. It's also the nature of oil as a commodity, which creates this enormous economic rents and then corrupts the whole system and the whole region. But one question for Paul and one for Steve. Paul, I mean, you talked about 300 years it took in Europe for things to change. Well, that was then in the sense that communications was not what it is today, right? You don't have instantaneous communication, you don't have the technology today. So the demonstration effect that we saw in Europe that took many, many centuries, why is it that with all the speed of communication, the speed of, and the idea that there are all these examples out there, that you haven't had a movement against the type of cultural hegemony that Ted talked about? I mean, because that cultural hegemony that Ted talked about existed during Luther's time as well, I mean, in Europe. So that's one, and also in institutions. I mean, Steve, you said institutions always represent the leading forces. That's true everywhere. I mean, it's not including here. But the question to you, Steve, is...
Doesn't this look like Turkey every day?
But the question to you, Steve, is that one of the problems that U.S. faces, I mean, there's a political culture here too, is that when something happens, everybody looks at the United States to respond to it. I mean, you can't just say, oh, well, this is happening there, but let whatever happens in Egypt take its own course. We're not going to intervene, right? There is an impulsivity, if you want, in the United States, that we always want to intervene. We come up with models, as you mentioned, in terms of the Arab Spring. We always, I mean, you can't press a button and stop that, right? So the United States is part of the problem, not because it wants to be part of the problem, it's because it's A, as being the hegemonic power in the world, and secondly, also because of the political culture that we need to do something about this. We need to help them, right? And in a sense, we are our own worst enemy.
I certainly didn't want to imply that it would take 300 years in any other region, with Europe being out in front. Of course, modern technology and communications makes a difference, and of course we would hope to speed some things up. But there's a huge difference between 300 years and the 4 years of a presidential term as the realistic time frame in which we could expect something like liberal democracy to take hold. You mentioned communication, demonstration effects. Well, part of the problem is the bad effects are demonstrated and communicated along with the good ones. And so I think of some of the turmoil and post-invasion in Iraq when Condi Rice was trying to reassure people, well, these are the birth pangs of democracy. And a lot of the reaction in the region was, if that's democracy, I don't want it. So it's not all just good demonstration effects, it's the bad as well. And that's in addition to the more deeply rooted things that I think that Ted Katouf was talking about, which go beyond what can be demonstrated at the political level, but really get to the core of society, and that I think even the information superhighway cannot change all that fast.
Did you have anything?
Yeah, I have just very, very, very quickly in response to Henri. I agree with you that there is a problem here as well. It comes from a good place. We saved the world from Nazism, we saved the world from communism, and something happens 6,000 miles away, and everybody gets around a table and says, well, what should we do about it? I think that's a problem. If you remember, in the immediate post-9/11 environment, we were going to reform the education systems of Arab countries, things that we are ill-equipped to do. And I reminded people at the time we were sitting in a city that had like the worst public education system in the country at the time. But I'm glad you asked the question, though, because I wanted to disagree slightly with Paul's response to the previous question about offshore balancing and hegemony. I want us to be a hegemon in the region. Three of my core interests was making sure no other country in the region dominates it. No other country dominates the region other than the United States. But I don't want to dominate the region because I want to make Egypt a democracy, or that I think I can make Turkey a democracy. I want to dominate it so that Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the Qataris, the Egyptians don't take matters into their own hands and screw things up in a way that undermines our core interests in the free flow of energy out of the region, helping to ensure Israeli security, making sure, counterproliferation, counterterrorism, et cetera, et cetera. So the Obama administration took a much more passive approach to the region, or a different kind of approach to the region. And the Saudis took matters into their own hands. For example, look at the mess that we have in Yemen. So I would like for us to be the hegemon. I would like for the Saudis to say, hey, what do you think about us invading Yemen? And I'd like someone to say, stop, don't do that. The Houthis have been kicking your ass since 1934. Don't do it again. Right? That's what I would prefer. This offshore balancing passive stuff seems to me is asking for more trouble of the kind that we already have. But I don't want to be the hegemon to tell people how to live their lives, because not because I'm a bad person and I want to kill puppies, but because I know it doesn't work.
So you don't say anything about joining the same chair of people being executed?
I think rhetorically we can remain true to our values and say we stand for democracy and human rights, but we've done things like that and it hasn't really made that much of a difference.
Jacob, you're next.
Well, on the issue of Middle East countries mangling American core interests, what about America mangling its own core interests? Specifically, is the Trump administration blundering into a wider war with Syria and Iran?
Right, good question.
I'll let Paul take that, but I just want to say that is one hell of a jacket. I think that's very cool.
I think the risk is substantially increasing of exactly that. Certainly with regard to Iran, we've had nothing but unrelenting hostility expressed by this administration. We had a presidential trip to the region in which the major theme was anti-Iran, anti-Iran, anti-Iran. And it's not just the president. The Secretary of Defense, who is supposed to be one of the adults in the room, has been quite consistent in his portrayal of Iran as being, underlying just about every problem in the region. And our Secretary of State, in response to a congressional question just the other day, spoke specifically of regime change as being part of our policy toward Iran. And then you look at some of the things going on in Syria, and the shooting down of the Syrian jet was an escalation by us. What the Syrian plane was doing was not attacking U.S. forces. It wasn't even a matter of getting close to U.S. forces like with these responses we had near the Tomp facility down in the southern part of the country. It was attacking rebels that the U.S. supports. And even though General Dunford assures us, as far as the Russians are concerned, we still have the communications line. He acknowledged, and we haven't been talking to them since this shoot-down incident. So I worry a lot. We could be talking not about a specific premeditated initiation of hostilities, but the chances for an incident, such as an incident at sea, sparked partly by things like the aggressive tactics of the IRGC maritime elements, harassing our ships and so on. The chance of something escalating out of control very quickly is greater now than it was 6 months ago.
So where are the Boeing executives in the White House putting pressure on?
That would be one of a number of inconsistencies one could point to in the current administration's approach in terms of American jobs.
Yes, sir. Good.
I'm John Utley. I'm publisher of the American Conservative. I've written many years for antiwar.com for Reason. In the Reagan times, I was in the Voice of America because I knew how to get inside the communists' heads. I want to put on the table something first. Southeast Asia, there are examples. That was in chaos not so long ago, and it worked out very well. I want to put on the table another thought. The kind of democracy, we promote democracy as if it was just one man, one vote, and the majority rules. The whole thing about democracy is protecting minority rights. But in particular, there's Hernando de Soto's first book. He said, why doesn't democracy work in Latin America what it does in North America? Usually we say culture. It's a system of proportional representation. Electoral systems is dull, but proportional representation means that people vote for party lists, and the politicians love it because even smallest parties, the top guys will get into the Congress. Unlike the Anglo-American system, where there are distinct geographical areas and a representative represents real people with real problems, proportional is he's just part of the party selected by the party bosses, and that's the only choice the voters have. Venezuela is a good example. But we imposed that in Iraq. And among other things, the worst aspects of proportional representation is people then vote for their ethnic bloc because they think that the other guy's voting for his ethnic bloc. So I just want to put on the table for people here think about these things. In these countries, there's a lot of young people. They want, I might add Leon Lowe in South America, many you may know. He once said, nobody cares about freedom, least of all for their neighbors. And the only way to sell freedom and democracy, etc., limited government, is to say that's the only way you can have the goodies that the West produces, a rule of law and safety and property rights and things like that. And you start with that. The Mont Pelerin Society, I might add, they used to say democracy, now they say rule of law comes first. And just to put that on the table, that you all consider where these opportunities come up, that America shouldn't forgive its values. We should promote, it's forgotten promoting democracy, whatever we call it, but very much in accordance with the values we have, federalism, a government. Think of Iraq if they'd had a federal system with lots of local autonomy, etc., just to put these things in perspective.
Thank you very much, and I'll take that as a comment since we're running very close to time now, and I have sort of two more on my list. Marvin?
Stephen, just a moment. Marvin Weinbaum, Middle East Institute. Just a little while ago, Stephen, just in passing, touched on two items that I thought would have gotten, I'm really surprised, did not get more attention. All of our focus has been on the export of petrocarbons. But at least the layman would have expected that we'd be talking about the export of violence, the concern for nuclear proliferation, as is this just a red herring here, or have they not in many ways overshadowed, considering also what's happened in this country in terms of petrocarbon development, have they overshadowed as motives for our engagement in the region?
One of you, who would like to take that question? Paul?
Yeah, Marvin, I think you're right. We should have talked more about violent non-state actors. And yes, I think it's very appropriate to say, especially with ISIS still around, when you catalog, U.S. interests, the export of violence and trying to do something about it at the source is an important U.S. interest. Now, this raises all sorts of other issues as to exactly what is the relationship between things like a violent group controlling a piece of real estate in a place like Syria, Iraq, and the kind of terrorism that can strike us here in the West. And that's a whole other topic I've got some strong views on myself. But yes, I think we should have said more about that in talking about major U.S. priorities and interests in this region.
Yes, and incidentally, I think there is beginning to be a lot of work done on this sort of weird linkage between the proliferation of nuclear energy, climate change, and the dangers of nuclear weapons proliferation throughout the region. So the last question was the gentleman here.
Ted Voorhees, Covington and Burling. Fortunately, Steve has already answered most of my question in his comments about Saudi Arabia, but I wanted just to push it one little bit further. Is there something important going on with Saudi Arabia right now that may be bigger than an ill-advised decision on Yemen and an ill-advised decision on Qatar? They had 8 years of Obama withdrawal, or they felt that. They may be thinking that they're at risk existentially 10 years from now with an Iranian nuclear capability. They may wonder about what Trump means when he says America first. Is that leaving Saudi Arabia out? So is there something more fundamental going on with Saudi Arabia coming adrift? And if so, should Trump do something pretty quickly about that?
Okay, well, that's a very profound, important question, so I'm going to give both of you the opportunity to say something on Saudi Arabia, and then we will say good afternoon.
I think there's three things that we should keep in mind with regard to Saudi Arabia. One is it has embarked upon allegedly this wide-ranging reform program, which is quite destabilizing. I got in a lot of trouble in Riyadh because I wrote a piece about Vision 2030, and I called it Meet Saudi Arabia's Gamal Mubarak. And the point I was trying to make was that what the Deputy Crown Prince was trying to do was change the way in which business is done in Saudi Arabia. Not just business, but politics and business. Really going after the way in which Saudi Arabia has been run for as long as anyone can remember. That's a very dangerous and destabilizing thing. The second destabilizing factor in Saudi Arabia is that an Islamic State, or whatever becomes of the Islamic State, which has been around since the late 1990s, and I don't believe that the destruction of the Islamic State in Raqqa is going to end this problem, is that one cannot fairly call oneself the Islamic State unless they control Mecca and Medina. And so that means that Saudi Arabia is always going to be in the crosshairs of these groups, and it's going to be an ongoing problem for Saudi Arabia. On this question of whether, there was all kinds of clothing rending over what the president said in Riyadh, and I wasn't that stressed out about it. Again, given the kind of particularities of this administration, we don't want the Saudis going out there and freelancing. We don't want them testing out their new defense doctrine because we know they're not very good at it, and they cause all kinds of chaos. So if the Trump administration wants to give an embrace of the Saudis in a way that the Saudis feel more secure, that we're back to a more traditional approach where the United States is the provider of security in the region, I have less of a problem with that than the kind of, didn't look great, but I think that the Saudis have been desperate to hear a president of the United States say some of the things that the president said in Riyadh, and if that means that they will take our counsel with regard to Yemen and understand and we can come to some sort of agreement where they're not out there freelancing and creating chaos, I'm okay with it. Thus far, it hasn't worked because they went off half-cocked on this whole Qatar thing.
Okay, Paul, you have the last word.
Two major points about Saudi Arabia. One, I think it's a mistake to keep ourselves prisoners to a traditional relationship that was forged by FDR and Ibn Saud and a ship in the Suez Canal back during World War II, and then, as in the style of the current administration, saying, we're going all in, we're sword dancing with these people, and they're the good guys, and everyone else in the region, especially the ones on the other side of the Gulf, are the bad guys. We simply do not share the same set of interests, and we're talking about a regime, per our earlier discussions about democratic values and so on, that which shares nothing with us. And that's in addition to everything which Steve was alluding to in terms of the enormous blunder with a humanitarian disaster as a consequence in Yemen. So as far as the international relations are concerned, they're one of the players, they're one of the competitors for regional influence. Throwing our lot completely in and doing the sword dancing is a big mistake.
Sorry, I thought you were done.
No, just the second point is the internal side. When I was in the intelligence community with responsibilities in this area, our recurring nightmare, the kind of phone call in the middle of the night that, as a division chief I didn't want to get, was that the revolution has come to Saudi Arabia. There are the ingredients of substantial instability there, in which royal family politics can interact with some of the discontents and disruptions in the larger society. For years and years, the succession went from one son to another son of Abdulaziz. And the question was, well, when would we go to the grandsons? Well, now, Salman has decided for himself that he was going to get the right to do the transfer to the next generation, and he'd get to pick whom. And we just saw the other day, another move against Mohammed bin Nayef, who's the crown prince, and some of the authorities were taken away from him with regard to internal law enforcement and so on, which should be his responsibility as interior minister. Clearly, the 31-year-old Mohammed bin Salman is the one that the king is trying to make, the new king. I would be extremely surprised if there wasn't very strong opposing views elsewhere in the royal family, that even though we don't see most of this, we hardly see any of it publicly, is somehow going to bubble up to the surface, and we'll have other members of the family exploiting other points of view and discontent and sources of grievance in the larger society. There's just too much of an interest at stake here, and too many other royals who aren't just going to roll over and say, all right, Salman's the one who could decide this for himself. So I still worry about the call in the middle of the night about the revolution coming to Saudi Arabia. And I think that ought to be in the back of our minds in our dealings with Riyadh.
Maybe Mr. Kushner can go there after after Palestine.
Yeah.
Well, look, thank you both very much for
Thank
an
you very
extremely
much.
interesting, terribly depressing, I must say, discussion, and all the more reason to keep in touch and to follow up on some of these sectors. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.